Jack Miller believed winter had already taken everything from him: his brothers in uniform, his trust in the system, and the peace he never found after the war. He lived alone at the edge of Pine Ridge with only his aging canine, Rex. But one brutal night, as snow swallowed the forest, Rex suddenly ran into the darkness, barking the way he only did when a human life was in danger. What Jack found hanging upside down from a frozen tree was not an animal, but a young police officer, bound and left to die. Who did this? And why was there a hand-drawn patrol map marking a road that officially didn't exist? This is a story of a scarred U.S. Marine, a loyal canine, and a truth buried beneath snow and silence. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of courage, redemption, and quiet miracles. Snow had been falling since dusk, thick and relentless, burying Pine Ridge in a white silence that erased roads, memories, and excuses alike. Jack Miller stood at the narrow window of his cabin, watching the wind drag shadows through the trees like something alive, something searching. He was 44, broad-shouldered even after years of quiet erosion, with a Marine's posture that never fully relaxed, and a face carved by angles rather than softness. His jaw was squared and usually hidden beneath a short, untrimmed beard flecked with gray that had arrived earlier than it should have, and his eyes, steel blue, alert, restless, carried the distant weight of places most people only saw on screens. Afghanistan had taken his sleep, his marriage, and his taste for crowds, but it had not taken his instincts. Those he knew never truly left. They just waited. Behind him, the cabin was sparse and functional, built more for endurance than comfort, smelling faintly of wood smoke, coffee, and old canvas. This place was not a retreat. It was a perimeter. Rex lay near the door, his body long and solid against the floorboards, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat darkened by age and weather, one ear permanently bent from an old airborne operation gone wrong, and a thin scar slicing through the fur of his right hind leg. A souvenir from a blast that had nearly ended them both years ago. Rex moved slower now, favoring that leg on cold nights, but his eyes were still sharp, amber, and focused, the kind that missed nothing and forgave little. He had been Jack's canine partner overseas, trained to read silence, scent, and fear. And long after retirement paperwork said otherwise, Rex still worked. He always would. Jack trusted the dog more than he trusted himself, because Rex had never learned how to lie. The bark came suddenly, one sharp, violent sound that tore through the storm and stopped Jack mid-breath. It was not the warning bark Rex used for animals or trespassers. This bark was shorter, higher, urgent, edged with something else: recognition. Rex was already on his feet, nails scraping wood, body angled toward the door, ears rigid. Then came a second bark, closer together this time, and Rex lunged forward, pawing at the handle. Jack's pulse spiked, a familiar heat spreading through his chest. He had heard that bark before, years ago, in places where hesitation got people killed. "All right," Jack muttered, already reaching for his coat, his voice calm but tight. "I hear you." The storm swallowed them the moment they stepped outside. Snow stung Jack's face like gravel as Rex bolted ahead, cutting a sharp line into the drifts with practiced certainty. Jack followed, boots sinking deep, breath burning in his lungs, his mind clearing in the way it only ever did when something mattered. The forest pressed in close, black trunks rising like sentinels, branches groaning under the weight of ice. Rex slowed near a stand of pines, circling once, twice, then stopping abruptly. He whined, a sound Jack almost never heard from him. That was when Jack saw the boots, suspended above the ground, swaying slightly in the wind. His stomach dropped. The body came into view slowly, revealed piece by piece as Jack moved closer. A young man hanging upside down from a thick branch, ankles bound with rope, his uniform stiff with frost and blood. A police officer. The man's face was pale, lips cracked and blue, one eye swollen shut, breath shallow and uneven. Jack didn't hesitate. His training took over, efficient and ruthless in its clarity. Knife out, rope cut. Rex moved instantly, positioning himself beneath the falling weight, absorbing what he could as the officer collapsed into the snow with a muted groan. Jack was already checking vitals, stripping gloves from frozen hands, pressing his own coat around the man's chest. "Stay with me," Jack said quietly, his voice low and controlled, not unkind. The officer's eyes fluttered, unfocused. "You're safe. You hear me?" Rex lay down close, his body radiating heat, his head resting near the man's ribs, steady and deliberate, as if reminding him how breathing worked. Getting the officer back to the cabin was slow and brutal. The man barely responded, shivering violently, his weight dead and uncooperative. Jack supported him with a strength that surprised even himself, fueled by something old and grim inside him. He did not call the police. Not yet. In weather like this, with a body this cold, minutes mattered more than protocols. Inside the cabin, Jack worked fast. Fire stoked, wet clothes stripped away, skin warmed carefully, water dripped slowly onto cracked lips. Rex did not leave the man's side, eyes tracking every movement, ears flicking at sounds Jack could no longer hear. Only when the officer's breathing steadied did Jack allow himself to exhale. He noticed the man's name tag then, bent and barely attached. Ethan Brooks. Young. Too young. Jack felt a familiar anger coil in his gut, sharp and quiet. Someone had done this deliberately. As he checked the officer's pockets for ID, his fingers brushed against folded paper tucked deep inside the jacket. Jack hesitated, then unfolded it. A hand-drawn patrol map. Pencil lines, a route marked in red, cutting straight through an area Jack knew well. Too well. There was no trail there. Jack stared at the map, the storm howling outside, Rex watching him with unreadable eyes, and understood one thing with absolute clarity. This had not been an accident. Morning came slowly, diluted by snow and cloud, turning the world outside Jack Miller's cabin into a colorless blur where sky and ground seemed undecided about their boundaries. The fire had burned low but steady through the night, and the air inside smelled of ash, wet wool, and something faintly metallic. Blood, diluted by heat and time. Jack sat at the small wooden table, with his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped, watching the rise and fall of the chest of the man on the couch. Ethan Brooks was still alive. That fact alone felt heavier than relief. It felt like responsibility. Ethan looked younger in daylight, mid-20s at most, with a narrow face that still held traces of softness despite the bruising, brown hair cropped short in regulation style, and hands that twitched occasionally, as if his body was replaying moments his mind refused to hold. His uniform lay folded nearby, stiff with ice and dirt. Jack had cleaned the wounds he could, splinted what seemed unstable, and kept the man warm through the long hours before dawn. Years ago, he would have called this routine. Now, it felt personal. Rex lay stretched along the edge of the couch, his chin resting near Ethan's ribs, amber eyes half-lidded but alert, rising only when Ethan's breathing changed. The old dog had not slept. He never did when someone under his watch was vulnerable. Ethan stirred just after sunrise. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then narrowing as awareness returned. Pain followed close behind. He tried to sit up and failed, a sharp breath escaping his lips. Jack was there instantly, one hand firm on his shoulder, voice calm and grounded. "Easy," he said. "You're safe. Don't fight it." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat working. "Where?" "Pine Ridge," Jack replied. "My place." "You're in bad shape." Ethan nodded faintly, the movement barely perceptible. His gaze drifted to Rex, confusion flickering before recognition settled in. "K9, he murmured. "Didn't know anyone out here still had one." Jack didn't correct him. Later that morning, after Ethan had taken water and managed a few careful sips of broth, Jack stepped outside to clear his head. The storm had eased into a steady fall, flakes drifting down with deceptive calm. Pine Ridge lay quiet in the distance, a town that pretended to be small and honest because it had never been forced to look too closely at itself. Jack pulled out his phone, hesitated, then dialed the number Ethan had given him before exhaustion dragged him back under. Sarah Collins answered on the third ring. Her voice was steady but tight, controlled in the way of people who had learned to manage chaos professionally. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with pale skin that burned easily in summer, and dark blonde hair she usually kept pulled back in a practical knot. She worked as a nurse at the Pine Ridge Medical Center, known for her calm under pressure and her sharp intolerance for nonsense. Jack had never met her, but he recognized the tone immediately. This was a woman used to being the only adult in the room. When Jack told her Ethan was alive, there was a pause, just long enough for emotion to surge and be forcibly contained. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "He wouldn't just disappear." Sarah had already called the sheriff's office twice that morning. The response she'd received was polite, procedural, and cold. Ethan Brooks, she'd been told, was logged as having left his assigned patrol route without authorization. Rookie mistake. His file had been temporarily closed pending review. No search protocol initiated. No public notice issued. Jack felt something harden in his chest as she spoke. A man didn't vanish into a blizzard by accident, not without someone noticing. Not without someone caring. "They said he probably took off," Sarah added, anger slipping through now. "That he needed time. Like he'd just wander into the woods and forget how radios work." Jack hung up and went back inside, the warmth of the cabin doing little to ease the chill spreading through him. He looked at Ethan again, really looked, at the bruises too symmetrical to be accidental, the rope burns around his ankles, the way his hands curled defensively even in sleep. This wasn't negligence. It was design. Rex lifted his head, ears pricking, as Jack moved toward the pile of Ethan's gear. The radio lay there, its casing scratched but intact. Jack picked it up, turned it over slowly. At first glance, it looked dead. No signal, no response. But Jack had handled enough field equipment to know the difference between damage and silence. He opened the back panel with careful fingers. The battery was fine. The switch, however, was not. It had been toggled off deliberately. Not snapped, not shorted, turned. Jack exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that carried no relief. He glanced toward Ethan, still resting, and then at Rex, who watched him steadily, tail thumping once against the floor as if confirming what Jack already knew. Someone had wanted Ethan unheard, unfound, and the town had agreed to let him stay that way. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless, covering tracks, burying questions, making it easier for a man to disappear. Jack stood there for a long moment, radio in hand, understanding that whatever had followed Rex out into the storm the night before had not ended at the tree. It had only just begun. By the second afternoon, the storm had thinned into a pale curtain of snow that drifted lazily past the cabin windows as if the mountain itself were catching its breath. The fire crackled with a steadier rhythm now, and the silence inside the cabin had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of survival, but the brittle kind that comes when truth presses close, waiting to be spoken. Jack Miller noticed it in the way Ethan Brooks lay awake longer between sips of water, in the way his eyes tracked the ceiling beams as if counting exits, and in the way Rex had begun pacing again, slow and deliberate, nose low, tail stiff. Ethan finally asked to sit up. Jack helped him, bracing his weight with practiced ease. In daylight, the young officer looked even more worn than before. His face was angular but not yet hardened, the sharpness of his cheekbones undercut by exhaustion rather than age. There was no beard, only the faint shadow of one that spoke of academy regulations and long shifts rather than personal choice. His eyes were a muted hazel, alert but guarded now, the look of someone who had learned in a single night that the world he trusted did not operate by the rules he'd been taught. "They told me it was a new route," Ethan said quietly, his voice hoarse. "A shortcut they hadn't added to the system yet." Jack said nothing, only waited. Years in uniform had taught him that silence was often the fastest way to the truth. Ethan swallowed. "I'd never heard of it." No one else had either, but it came down the chain, so I didn't question it. His hands clenched unconsciously in the blanket. They said it was routine, just a quick patrol, in and out before the storm hit. He let out a short, humorless breath. Guess that was the point. Rex stopped pacing and moved toward the pile of gear stacked near the wall. He sniffed once, then again more insistently this time, his nose pressing against the side of Ethan's ballow. Jack watched closely. Rex was not curious by nature. He was precise. The dog circled, then pawed at a seam near the bottom of the pack, a place Jack hadn't checked. "You want to explain that?" Jack asked, his voice calm but edged now. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I was hoping you wouldn't find it that way." Jack knelt, unzipped the hidden pocket, and pulled out a small USB drive attached to a short length of cord, the kind meant to clip discreetly to body armor. It was scuffed, scratched, but intact. Ethan opened his eyes again. "I copied the footage myself," he said, "before I went out." Jack looked up sharply. "Why?" "Because something felt off," Ethan replied. "The order didn't come through dispatch, it was verbal." "And the map they gave me?" He shook his head slowly. "It didn't match anything in the system. I didn't want to accuse anyone. I just wanted proof, in case I was wrong." Rex sat beside Jack now, tail still, ears forward, as if standing witness. Jack crossed the room and powered on his old laptop, the screen flickering to life with reluctant obedience. When he plugged in the USB, the machine whined softly, then settled. The footage began shakily, the camera angled toward a stretch of forest Ethan had never seen before. Trees packed too close, ground too even, the silence unnaturally complete. Ethan's breathing was audible in the recording, controlled but tense. Then the voices came. One from the left. Another from behind. The image jerked as Ethan turned, heart rate spiking. Two figures emerged from the tree line, both wearing tactical gear dark enough to blend with the forest. One carried himself like military, shoulders squared, movements efficient and practiced. The other stepped forward more casually. He wore a jacket unmarked except for a patch stitched cleanly into the chest. The footage froze for half a second as the camera tried to adjust. Jack leaned closer. His jaw tightened. "Pause it," he said. Ethan fumbled for the trackpad and did as told. The patch was unmistakable. It was not the standard insignia of a patrol officer, nor the subdued emblem worn by deputies in the field. It belonged higher up the ladder, command level, administrative, rarely seen outside offices or ceremonies. Jack had seen similar symbols overseas, worn by men who gave orders but never walked the ground themselves. "That doesn't belong out there," Jack said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied. "That's when I realized I wasn't supposed to come back." The footage resumed. Shouting followed, a struggle. The image spun violently as Ethan tried to retreat, boots slipping on frozen earth. There was a blow, hard, efficient, and then darkness. Jack closed the laptop slowly. The fire popped, sending a brief spray of sparks up the chimney. Rex let out a low growl, not loud enough to break the stillness, but deep enough to mean something. Jack stood and paced the length of the room, every instinct he'd buried since leaving the Marines now fully awake. This wasn't a rogue act. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an operation. Someone with authority had put a rookie officer onto a trail that didn't exist and made sure no one came looking when he didn't return. Jack stopped near the window, staring out at the snow-covered forest that hid its secrets well. "You did the right thing," Jack said finally, turning back to Ethan. "You trusted your gut." Ethan didn't answer. He just nodded, the weight of that night settling visibly into his posture. Rex moved closer to him, resting his head against Ethan's leg, steady and warm. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of branches cracking under ice. Jack knew then that whatever Ethan had stumbled into was larger than Pine Ridge, larger than any one man. And now that the truth had been pulled into the light, it would not stay quiet for long. Night fell hard over Pine Ridge, the kind of winter night that pressed against the cabin walls with cold and intent, as if the forest itself were leaning in to listen. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. Jack Miller did not sleep. He sat at the small table with his back straight, the old Marine habit impossible to shed, listening to the wind comb through the pines and to the quieter sounds beneath it. The groan of wood, the distant crack of ice, the rhythm of Rex's breathing near the door. Something had shifted since the video. Jack could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to feel incoming trouble long before radios crackled or alarms screamed. Ethan lay on the couch, wrapped in blankets, drifting in and out of restless sleep. The bruises along his arms and neck had darkened, painting his pale skin with proof of what had been done to him. Sarah Collins sat in the chair beside him, jacket still on, boots unlaced but not removed. She had arrived before dusk, driving through snow that would have turned most people back. In the firelight, her face looked sharper, more tired than it had over the phone. Her hair, dark blonde with hints of ash, was pulled into a low ponytail now, strands slipping loose around her temples. She was tall and lean, all angles and restraint, with hands that moved confidently when checking Ethan's pulse or adjusting his bandage, but trembled faintly when she thought no one was watching. Years in emergency rooms had taught her how to stay calm in other people's crises, but this one was too close. Ethan wasn't just a patient, he was family, by choice. Rex lay near the front door, his body angled toward it, head up, ears twitching at sounds Jack could barely register. The German Shepherd's muzzle had gone gray around the edges, and his movements were slower than they once were. But there was nothing soft about the way he watched the darkness beyond the glass. He had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself. It slipped in quietly, counting on complacency. The sound came just after midnight. A faint crunch outside, almost lost beneath the wind. Rex's ears snapped forward, his body going rigid. Jack was on his feet instantly, one hand raised to signal silence. Sarah froze, her breath catching. Another sound followed, closer this time. Not an animal. Too deliberate. Jack reached under the loose floorboard near the table and pulled free the handgun he hadn't touched in years. The metal felt cold and familiar in his palm. He didn't want to use it. He knew he might have to. The glass shattered without warning. A gloved hand punched through the side window, followed by the dull thud of a boot against the wall. Rex lunged before Jack could shout, his weight slamming into the intruder with a ferocity that seemed to steal the air from the room. The man cried out, muffled behind a mask, stumbling backward into the snow as Rex clamped down on his arm. Another figure appeared at the door, taller, broader, moving with practiced coordination, weapon raised. Jack stepped forward and fired a single shot into the ceiling beam above the door. The crack of it split the night, sharp and final. The message was clear. Leave. Outside, chaos erupted. Shouts, hurried movement, the crunch of boots retreating into the drifts. Rex released the first man and backed toward the cabin, blood darkening the snow where his teeth had found flesh. Jack didn't pursue. He knew better than to chase into darkness without a plan. He slammed the door shut and braced it with the heavy table, heart pounding, senses stretched thin. Sarah was already moving, dragging the couch to block the shattered window, her face pale but focused. Ethan groaned, trying to sit up, confusion flashing across his features. "Stay down," Sarah ordered, her voice sharp now, professional instinct overriding fear. Minutes passed. Then more. The forest settled again, as if nothing had happened at all. Jack waited longer than felt necessary, then longer still. When he finally stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap. Snow swirled across the clearing, half covering the tracks already. Rex followed, limping slightly but alert, his nose working the ground with intense concentration. What remained told a clear story. Blood, fresh, dark, not enough to be fatal but enough to leave a trail. Boot prints, deep and deliberate, pressed into the snow in a pattern Jack recognized instantly. Military-issue soles. Not cheap, not civilian, and scattered among the debris of broken glass and splintered wood, nothing was missing. No drawers ransacked, no supplies taken. The generator untouched, the food stores intact. This was not a robbery. Jack returned inside and closed the door carefully. He didn't need to say it out loud. Sarah saw it in his face. "They weren't here for you," she said quietly. Jack shook his head. Not exactly. He crossed to the table, opened the drawer, and checked the laptop. The USB was still there, tucked where he'd hidden it earlier. Untouched. The realization settled heavily between them. They knew it existed, Sarah said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were dark with understanding. Jack nodded. And they wanted it gone. Ethan stared at them, the truth sinking in slowly, painfully. "So they didn't come to finish me," he said. "They came to erase what I saw." Rex moved closer to him then, resting his head against Ethan's leg again, a quiet, grounding presence. Jack looked from the dog to the young officer and felt a familiar, unwelcome resolve take hold. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about custody of the truth. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping fresh snow over the blood and footprints, trying its best to make the night forget. But Jack knew better. Once a trail was scented, it didn't matter how deep the snow fell. Someone would keep following it. Dawn came thin and colorless, the kind of winter morning that felt unfinished, as if the sun itself were uncertain whether it should rise. Jack Miller stood over the rough table with a hand-drawn patrol map lay spread flat, its pencil lines faint but deliberate. The red-marked route cut through a section of forest Jack knew intimately, not by name, but by memory. He had moved through similar terrain years ago in another country, another war, where maps lied and the ground told the truth only to those trained to listen. His fingers traced the line slowly. "This isn't a mistake," he said at last. "It's a corridor. They wanted him funneled." Sarah Collins tightened her jacket as she listened, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face. She looked out of place in the wilderness, too clean, too composed. But there was nothing fragile about her. She had the kind of posture that came from long nights on her feet, from lifting bodies heavier than her own, from learning when to push and when to let go. Her eyes were focused, practical. "If that trail doesn't exist on paper," she said, "then whatever's out there wasn't meant to be seen." Ethan Brooks sat nearby, wrapped in layers borrowed from Jack,
his movements slower now, but steadier than the day before. The color had begun to return to his face, though the bruises remained like stains that refused to fade. He listened closely, jaw tight, the weight of memory pressing down harder with every word. "I remember the order," he said quietly.
Came down clean, no hesitation, like it was routine. His hands clenched. But there was one thing that didn't fit. Jack looked up. "They told me not to log anything beyond the first marker," Ethan continued. "Said the terrain past that point was unstable. I didn't think much of it then." He swallowed. "I do now." They left the cabin just after mid-morning. The storm had finally broken, but the cold remained, sharp and unforgiving. Rex led the way, moving with the confidence of an old professional, his nose low, body angled forward despite the stiffness in his gait. The German Shepherd was no longer fast, but he was precise, choosing paths where the snow lay thinner, where the forest floor revealed just enough to read. Jack followed behind him, rifle slung across his back more out of habit than intent. Sarah stayed close to Ethan, matching her pace to his, offering steady support without comment. The forest thickened as they moved deeper, the trees crowding in, branches heavy with snow. Hours passed. No marked trail, no signage, just silence and the steady crunch of boots. Jack felt it before he saw it. The subtle change in the ground, the way the snow lay smoother here, as if disturbed and then carefully replaced. He raised a hand, signaling a stop. Rex froze instantly. It was there, half buried beneath drift and debris. A low structure, its roof line barely visible, camouflaged by snow and fallen branches. Jack brushed away the powder with his glove, revealing weathered timber reinforced with steel bands. "This isn't old," he said. "It's hidden." They worked carefully, clearing an entrance enough to force it open. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of fresh-cut wood, sharp, resinous, unmistakable. Inside, the space widened into a concealed storage pit. Stacked neatly along the walls were planks of timber unlike anything harvested legally in Montana. Dense, dark-grained, protected species Jack recognized instantly. His stomach tightened. He had seen this before, overseas, where forests were stripped quietly and sold loudly, where corruption wore uniforms and smiled for cameras. Sarah stepped closer, her breath catching. "This is organized," she said. "Not opportunistic." Jack nodded. He knelt beside a crate and pried it open just enough to see inside. Along the edge, carved into the wood, were small symbols, slashes crossed by short lines. To anyone else, they might have looked like damage. To Jack, they were unmistakable. "These are trafficking marks," he said, "used to track origin and destination. I saw the same system during joint operations years ago." Ethan stared at the markings, recognition dawning slowly. "I've seen those," he said, "on confiscated loads, but never this close to town." He paused, then frowned. "There's something else." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document he'd kept since the academy, edges worn thin. A patrol restriction order. "This zone," he said, pointing to the map. "I was explicitly barred from entering it during my first week. They said it was for my safety." Jack took the paper, eyes scanning the text. The signature at the bottom was clean, confident, too confident. He knew the name before he finished reading it. Sheriff Daniel Moore. The man whose face hung on posters downtown. The man who shook hands at town halls and spoke about integrity like it was a birthright. Jack felt a slow, controlled anger settle in his chest. Not explosive, focused. The kind that had kept him alive once. Sarah exhaled slowly. "So the man who ordered him away from this place is the same man who controls the department?" Ethan nodded, bitterness creeping into his voice. "And the same man who approved my patrol routes." Rex growled softly.
a low vibration in his chest, as if sensing the shift in the air. Jack folded the document carefully and handed it back. "This wasn't about keeping you safe," he said. "It was about keeping you blind." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the discovery pressing in from all sides. The forest around them remained still, indifferent. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier, already working to bury the evidence they had uncovered. Jack knew they couldn't stay. The truth, once disturbed, attracted attention. And now they knew exactly who would come looking. The decision to go public was made quietly, without ceremony, in the narrow space between fear and necessity. Snow continued to fall over Pine Ridge, softening the edges of the town and pretending nothing beneath it was rotting. Sarah Collins stood near the window of Jack's cabin, phone pressed to her ear, her reflection pale against the glass. In the gray daylight, she looked thinner than before, her tall frame wrapped in a borrowed coat that hung loose on her shoulders. Strands of her dark blonde hair had escaped its tie and brushed her cheek, and the skin beneath her eyes showed the faint shadows of sleepless nights. She spoke in a measured tone, precise and controlled, the way she did with trauma patients, never rushing, never oversharing, but never backing down. The man on the other end of the line was Luke Harris, an investigative journalist whose name carried weight well beyond Montana. Luke Harris had built his reputation on stories that made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. He was in his early 40s, lean and sharp-featured, with a narrow face framed by dark hair, always in need of a trim, and a short beard he forgot to shave when chasing a lead. His voice, calm and inquisitive, betrayed a mind that never stopped sorting details, arranging them into patterns others missed. He listened as Sarah spoke, asking only a few questions, the right ones. When she finished, there was a pause, not of doubt, but of calculation. "Send me what you have," he said. "But we do this in pieces. If it all drops at once, it disappears." They sent the first fragment that afternoon, a blurred still from Ethan's body cam, cropped tight enough to hide faces but clear enough to show the insignia. It didn't name anyone. It didn't accuse. It asked a question. Within hours, it spread. By nightfall, local news stations were calling it an anomaly. By morning, federal inboxes had begun to fill. Jack Miller watched the coverage without comment, his expression set in the same hard neutrality he'd worn in briefing rooms years ago. The weight of the rifle on his shoulder felt heavier now, not because of danger, but because of what it represented. Once, he had believed law was something you enforced. Then he learned it was something people bent. Rex stayed close, his gait stiff but purposeful, eyes tracking movement beyond the tree line as if the forest itself had begun to whisper warnings. Ethan Brooks sat on a fallen log, breath visible in the cold, his jaw clenched tight. The bruises on his face had faded to sickly yellow, but something deeper had settled into his eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Betrayal aged a man faster than time. They moved at dusk. Not toward town, not back to the cabin, but deeper into the forest, following a route Jack remembered from long before. Snow muffled their steps, and the trees pressed close, heavy with ice. Jack felt it again, that familiar sense of being watched. Then Rex stopped, hackles rising, a low warning growl vibrating through his chest. Voices followed. Distant, controlled, not locals. The chase began without warning. Shouts cut through the trees, boots pounding behind them. Jack signaled left, then right, forcing their pursuers into narrower ground. Rex broke away suddenly, sprinting ahead, drawing attention. Ethan stumbled, caught his balance, then froze as a memory surfaced unbidden. A phrase from the video, not shouted. Spoken calmly, almost reassuringly. "Just follow the markers. You'll be fine." The voice had sounded familiar even then. Now, in the cold, with adrenaline burning through him, recognition struck like a blow. Sheriff Daniel Moore. Ethan's breath caught. The same cadence, the same measured authority, the voice of a man who had shaken his hand and welcomed him to Pine Ridge. Behind them, Rex disappeared into a stand of trees Jack knew well. Years ago, Jack had helped clear this section after a storm, digging trenches to divert meltwater. The ground beyond was unstable, hidden beneath a deceptive layer of snow. Rex reappeared briefly, barking once, then vanished again. The first pursuer followed without hesitation. There was a sharp crack, a shout, and then silence. The others slowed, uncertainty creeping in. Jack took the moment to fire a warning shot into a tree trunk, splintering bark. The sound echoed, final and unmistakable. The pursuers retreated, dragging one of their own, curses fading into the dark. They didn't stop moving until the forest thinned and the town lights appeared in the distance, blurred and distant, like something remembered rather than real. Jack leaned against a tree, breathing hard, the cold biting through his gloves. Sarah joined them moments later, having taken a separate route to avoid detection. Her face was flushed, eyes bright with a mix of fear and resolve. "Luke's second piece went live," she said quietly. "This one names patterns." Not names. Yet. Ethan swallowed, his voice rough. "It was him," he said. The voice. Jack looked at him steadily. "You're sure?" Ethan nodded. "I'd know it anywhere." Rex sat between them, chest heaving, a smear of blood dark against his fur, where ice had reopened an old wound. Jack rested a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. The truth was no longer buried. It had been pulled out piece by piece, and now it was tearing through the very system meant to contain it. Snow continued to fall, indifferent as ever. But beneath it, something had broken free, and there would be no burying it again. Snow fell lightly over Pine Ridge, the kind that did not howl or threaten, but settled gently, as if the land itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. The forest stood quiet, tall pines dusted white, their branches no longer hiding secrets, but carrying the weight of truth, at last. The first federal vehicles arrived before dawn. Black SUVs cut through the snow-covered road with practiced precision, their lights muted, their presence unmistakable. Agents moved with calm efficiency, not rushed, not loud. Among them was Special Agent Thomas Reed, a man in his late 40s with a lean, angular build and close-cropped dark hair flecked with gray at the temples. His face bore the steady lines of someone who had spent decades watching lies unravel. Reed spoke little, his voice low and deliberate, but when he did, people listened. He had seen corruption before. Pine Ridge was not his first reckoning, but it would be one of the quieter ones, quiet in sound, loud in consequence. Sheriff Daniel Moore was taken into custody without resistance. He stood on the steps of the county office, broad-shouldered even now, his once commanding presence diminished by the cuffs around his wrists. His graying beard was neatly trimmed as always, his uniform immaculate, as if presentation might still matter. But his eyes avoided the crowd. Years of authority had taught him confidence, yet exposure stripped it away faster than fear ever could. Charges followed swiftly. Illegal logging operations spanning state land, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. The town watched in stunned silence. The man who had signed warrants and blessed community barbecues was led away like any other criminal. Ethan Brooks stood at the edge of the crowd, leaning slightly on a cane he no longer truly needed. His recovery had been steady, not just in body, but in spirit. The bruises had faded, and color had returned to his face, but the experience had carved something deeper into him, a sharpened sense of purpose. At 26, Ethan looked older now, his once boyish features set with resolve. His brown hair was trimmed short again, regulation neat, and his uniform sat straighter on his shoulders.
He returned to the force quietly weeks later, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. He chose transparency over comfort, duty over silence. Sarah Collins remained close to the investigation, her role unofficial but essential. Tall and slender, with her dark blonde hair usually tied back in a low knot, she carried herself with a quiet authority shaped by years in emergency rooms and crisis wards. Her pale skin contrasted with the dark circles beneath her eyes, a testament to long nights reviewing transcripts and footage alongside federal investigators. Sarah never sought the spotlight. She focused on details, timelines, human cost. Her calm demeanor anchored those around her, even when the truth grew heavy. Jack Miller declined every interview request that followed. Cameras waited at the edge of the road. Reporters left messages that went unanswered. He had not acted for recognition, and he would not accept it now. Jack was a man shaped by war and loss. His broad frame still strong, despite the gray creeping into his beard and the permanent tension etched into his jaw. His eyes, a weathered steel blue, no longer scanned for enemies, but for signs of imbalance. Tracks that didn't belong, trees cut where they shouldn't be. When the governor's office offered him a formal role as a forestry conservation advisor, Jack hesitated only once. He accepted not for honor, but for alignment. Protecting the forest felt like guarding something he had once lost overseas and finally found again at home. Rex healed slower than the others, but he healed. At 10 years old, the German Shepherd bore his scars openly, a bent ear from a long-ago fall, a faint limp from shrapnel embedded years before Jack ever left the service. His sable coat had silvered with age, but his eyes remained alert, intelligent, deeply bonded. When the town council recognized him with a quiet ceremony, there were no speeches long enough to embarrass him. A simple citation. A hand-carved plaque. Rex accepted it with calm dignity, tail thumping once against Jack's leg. He had done his duty. Winter continued, but it no longer felt endless. Snow softened the paths through Pine Ridge, covering the marks of past violence and leaving room for new growth beneath. On a late afternoon, as dusk painted the sky in pale blues and grays, Jack, Rex, and Ethan stood at the forest's edge. No words were necessary. The trees stood tall, no longer complicit in silence. Jack rested a gloved hand on Rex's back. Ethan adjusted his coat against the cold, standing straighter than he had months before. Together they looked out over the land, not as something to conquer or exploit, but as something to guard. Snow drifted down between the branches, quiet and forgiving. The forest remained, and this time it was watched over by those who had learned what it cost to lose it. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through loyalty, courage, and a heart that refuses to look away. In this story, God did not part the forest or stop the storm. He sent a man who chose to act, a dog who chose to protect, and truth that refused to stay buried. In our own lives, we may feel lost, wounded, or forgotten, standing in the cold of our own Pine Ridge. But faith reminds us that no suffering is unseen, and no act of goodness is wasted. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in second chances, healing, and the quiet ways God still works through ordinary lives. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you through every storm. Amen.